All right, so hello and welcome everyone. This is another live stream. I'm your host, Jonathan McClatchy, and I'm very honored to be joined this afternoon by my friend Matthew Taylor. I've been on his podcast before called Still Unbelievable, which is basically a response to Unbelievable by Justin Barley and the podcast that Justin Barley hosts called Unbelievable, where he brings on Christians and non-Christians to have a constructive dialogue and debate. And Justin subsequently, 10 years into his podcasting career, published a book called Unbelievable, ? Why after 10 years of talking to atheists, I'm still a Christian. And Matthew Taylor is a contributor, I believe, to the response book that came out in response to that particular book, which is called Still Unbelievable. And so Matthew Taylor hosts the podcast Still Unbelievable, and I was on twice actually. Once with
Blaze.
I was on the second time with Brian Blaze. Who was the guy I was on the first time was Andrew.
It was Andrew Knight, yes. He's
Andrew
my
Knight,
co-host over on Still Unbelievable, yes.
Yes, so I had two very interesting, stimulating discussions there. And so I wanted to return the favor and have Matthew on my channel. I'm not sure if he's been on any Christian channels previously. Have you, Matthew? Or
I'm not sure I have. So, and I'm also a live stream virgin as well. So two ticks. Thank you for the invitation, Jonathan.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's good to have you here. So you also are an ex-Christian, and you grew up in a Bible-believing Christian family, and into your adult life, you went through a deconversion process. Do you want to maybe give us a little bit of introduction to that and tell us a little bit about your story?
Yes, certainly. And just to echo the thanks, Jonathan. And just as a very quick aside, I do need to get you back onto Still Unbelievable, because the habit that Andrew and I have is to ask our Christian guests if they have a favorite Bible character. And you've been on twice, and I've failed to ask you that question twice. So shame on me, but I've got an excuse to get you back again. So we'll see what we can do about arranging that. So very briefly about myself, I grew up in Zambia, in a missionary environment in Zambia. I went to boarding school from a very young age to a remote school in Zambia that was run by people who are connected to the missionary environment. So that's my brief background. I loved growing up in Zambia. It's that part of the country is just in my blood, and I miss growing up in that environment terribly. But the kind of Christianity which I was brought up was a very literalist, very young earth creationist environment, to the point where I don't even remember being taught that Adam and Eve might have had daughters, for example. So it really was an extremely literalist. One of the anecdotes I talk about or have mentioned is, I remember us getting new biology textbooks. And I remember us, when these new biology textbooks opened, we were told to open them to a specific page where there was a brief paragraph which talked about fish over generations, their fins turning into legs, and as they move from pond to pond, and that's how evolution was. It was a really bad and ropey description of evolution, but we were told to cross that out in pen, because when it came to that chapter in the book, we would be skipping over that chapter because we wouldn't be reading anything about evolution. So that was the kind of environment which I grew up on. So I left Zambia. I'm still had an English passport because my parents are English. So came over to the UK when I left home at around about 18, and obviously was still a Christian into my young adulthood. And that young earth creationist upbringing followed with me. It changed and softened over the years, but I was still very literalist. And in order to, when I look back over my story, I can see retrospectively that there are points in my story where I had challenges. But I think when I was going through my actual deconstruction, let's just use those words interchangeably, they all mean roughly the same thing, which started around about my mid-30s. So about 15 years ago, I would say, is probably when that really started. And I described the actual process of my deconversion taking about 3 years, from when I first realized that I was actually having serious doubts to the point at which I actually said to myself, now I no longer believe, or when I realized that now I no longer believed. So that period I describe as about 3 years. But when I look back retrospectively, I think previous to that 3 years, there were little points where I can look back and I think, okay, I had challenges to my mindset then, which I needed to do something with. And I suspect that those just seeped in through. And certainly one of them was a really good friend of my girlfriend, now my wife, at the time. She'd grown up with him, known him for many years. I got to know him obviously because he was her really good friend. And he disappeared from our lives around about the time we got married. And there's a whole story about that. But around about that time, the last time we saw him, he came out to us as gay. And it was really quite uncomfortable conversation. And I was very much an anti-gay person at that time. And I feel, if I'm honest, I feel a little bit of shame of that moment, because what that person needed from us, his friends, was acceptance and love. And I utterly failed to give him that. And sorry, I'm actually tearing up talking about that, because that's how much it affected me, and that's how much we miss that friendship as a couple. And so that really shook me when I realized actually what had happened, that as a Christian, my duty was to act to this person in love, and I hadn't. So that had a moment. I can't honestly say that started my deconstruction, but that's just, like I say, one of those little points where challenges came to me, where I realized I could be better. I should be better. And then on the flip side of that, as I got older, I got involved in cars, and there was a group of people that I knew, and we would just enjoy their cars. We would regularly do track days and just drive around. And this was a group that I enjoyed being with because of the car connection. Being with these people was never about evangelizing. It was never about me being a Christian. It was just about the cars. And all of these people, I think, are atheists, although it turned out later that some of those people had been young deconverts, but I didn't know that at the time. And I've known these people now for 20 years, but obviously it was only a few years at the time. And eventually it came out that not only was I a Christian, but I was one of those evolution denying Christians. So one day I just, on the online forum in which we discussed, the challenge just came out. And I thought, you know what? I've wanted to avoid the Christian subject with these guys, but maybe now's the time to do it. So I went all in, basically, with pushing my young earth agenda. And I want to be polite. So they basically handed my butt to me. Their knowledge of science was far superior to mine. They had an answer to every creationist trope that I wanted to give. And I came away from that conversation feeling really battered, feeling really bruised, thinking, how on earth could these people be so ignorant of the truth? And it was a genuinely painful experience for me. And there was also an element of cognitive dissonance in myself during that moment. I didn't immediately recognize it as that, but it really was quite a difficult emotional and mental experience for me. So I decided then I really needed to learn a lot more about evolution. So I put a lot more effort into evolution. And to kind of set the scene, around about this time, I'd got a job where I was working a lot from home. And that was also around about the time that podcasts started to become a thing. So I was working at home. I had iTunes on the computer, and I would listen to podcasts. And so I would be listening to The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, to Point of Inquiry, which I think at the time was fronted by DJ Grothy. And there were a few Christian podcasts. I can't remember any of them at the time. And Astronomy Cast was another podcast that I really, really enjoyed listening to. So a lot of these early podcasts that have been around for a long time. It will be a while before I think Unbelievable arrived, but I did eventually discover Unbelievable, but this was before Unbelievable. And what I found during that was, when I listened to Christians talking about young earth creationism and scientists talking about evolution and cosmology and the age of the universe, I realized that there was actually a stark difference with the way that people talked. and with the way that the scientists explained not only what they knew, but how they knew what they knew, and with the way that the young Earth creationist pastors would talk about that. And it wasn't very long before I actually just started deleting the Young Earth Creationist podcast that I was listening to, because I was being really unsatisfied by them. And around about that time, I had a bit of an aha moment. So I need to pause and rewind a little bit. Around about the age of 20, I think it was, I had a very dramatic spiritual, I call it a spiritual experience. It started off with a bit of a deliverance. Well, I say a bit of a deliverance. It was a deliverance. It lasted a reasonable amount of time, and it was quite stressful. And it was accompanied with a really stressful time of my life. To kind of set the scene on that, my parents separated and ultimately divorced when I was 9. Again, that was terrible for me. And I always say that my teenage years, I was depressed for almost the entirety of my teenage years because of the fallout of this terrible and really, really painful separation that my parents went through. And it affected me deeply and it traumatized me. And when I look back, I'm fairly confident that my teenage years just accompanied by a dark depression for the entirety of it, but I didn't know it at the time. And as a result of all that, the relationship with my father at that time was enormously fractured. And there are times when I hadn't spoken to my father for quite some time. And that period of my life was when I was in a really dark place in my relationship with my father. And so this deliverance experience sort of like came in about that. I'd had some counseling for my relationship with my father. I desperately wanted to do something positive to help that relationship. And that all came to a head all in that kind of weekend. And so there was that deep emotional trauma. But the key moment I want to mention is about a week after that experience, I had a moment, and to shorten the whole story, it was effectively sleep paralysis. But it wasn't diagnosed as sleep paralysis at the time. It was diagnosed as a demonic attack. And I was utterly terrified by this experience. And I woke up, and my mother at the time went to a church that did a lot of spiritual involvement, spiritual healing and deliverance kind of ministry. So she was the person I spoke to about this, and she spoke to the people that she knew. And it was all said, yeah, that was definitely an attack from the devil. You need to sort of like pray on the blood of Jesus if it ever happens again. It never happened again. But anyway, but that was a moment which, it was an experience which I always called a spiritual experience. And that the reason why I mentioned it was, in the times I had my doubts in my 20s, if I ever doubted the existence of God, I always went back to that moment, because I thought, if God is real, if God isn't real, how do I explain that moment? You know, if God and the devil and demons are real, that is the only way that that can be explained. And that would be the anchor which would bring me back if ever I had a doubt about Christianity, a doubt about God being real. So that's why I mentioned that. It was one of those moments which really kept me in my faith. So when I go back forward again to, I'm in this job at home, we've literally just had our daughter. I'm in my mid-30s and I'm listening to these podcasts. My young earth creationism is weakening, and I'm starting to appreciate that the universe is old, the earth is old, the species have evolved. And one podcast I happen to listen to talks about sleep paralysis and describes the sleep paralysis. And I go, that's that thing that I had in my bedroom, in my flat all those years ago that woke me up utterly terrified. That's what I had. And suddenly this thing that had been diagnosed as a spiritual attack had a natural explanation. And it was really quite confusing at first. I thought, wow, okay, what do I do with this? And I say literally, I don't know whether it was that moment or whether it was several weeks later, but I stopped believing that that moment was a spiritual moment, and that it was just a natural moment of sleep paralysis, which is well understood. And because of my state, because of my mental state and my beliefs at the time, I just went to what worked but was wrong. And that was probably the very first domino that actually genuinely fell in the whole thing. But I think probably what was so devastating about it for my story was because it was a key moment that I anchored to, my anchor had got taken away. And that literally allowed everything else to fall. So I started questioning everything else. Of course, within the whole old earth and the evolution narrative, obviously the Adam and Eve question comes up. So I now had permission to doubt that Adam and Eve existed, which of course, so you've got all these other classic bits from the Old Testament. You've got the Tower of Babel, you've got the global floods, and so those go, and then you start questioning other ones, like the battles of Joshua, like the city of Ai, did that really happen? And then you've got Joseph and the Exodus from Egypt, and did that really happen? And so all these key moments start evaporating into something that I'm free to not believe. It doesn't necessarily mean I know exactly what happened. It's just I'm free to not believe them. And so when all of these things go, you then get to the New Testament, you think, well, what do I do now? I've taken away a lot of the foundation for the New Testament, a lot of the build up to the New Testament. What do I do about Jesus? And if the whole point of Jesus was because man was fallen and the redemption of man, but now I don't believe in Adam and Eve, and I don't believe any of that story. And so I can't explain the fall of man. So the fall of man has been taken away. Well, if the fall of man's been taken away, then Jesus is irrelevant. There's no need for Jesus. The whole Jesus' story makes absolutely no sense if there isn't a fall. So maybe that story isn't quite. And so all this creeping doubt and unable to explain it. And in one of the episodes that you were on with us, you asked me directly, am I a mythicist? And I think I answered, I'm on the fence. I don't know how to sway with that. And I'm pretty much the same. I certainly don't believe the miracles, but I don't know if I have enough information to even believe in the character of Jesus. I'm prepared to accept there was a character of Jesus. I certainly don't go down the road was Jesus' character never existed, but I don't accept the miracles. So it's what do I do with do that? I've lost my track now. But anyway, the point is that the whole salvation, redemption of man ceased to become relevant or necessary. And I think when I got to that point, I realized that I had to answer the question of God. And I can't remember. It was 15 years ago. I'm a little bit fuzzy on some of these technicality details. But I obviously had to then answer the question of God, because certainly if God is real, then I need to work back and then decide what part of the Bible narrative does work with God and how can I make it fit. So I had to land at the question of God. And I knew it couldn't be the literalist, young earth creationist background that I grew up with. It would have to be something else. And I spent goodness knows how many nights lying there asleep, trying to work out what part of what Christianity can I work with? How liberal do I want to go with my Christianity if I can't accept parts of the Bible? And which bits can I take? And I think where I went was, if there are bits, certainly like the miracles, that I can't accept, then there's precious little of Christianity that I can take. And at some point I went through the thought process of, if I do still accept Christianity, aren't I just guilty of picking the bits that fit, picking the bits that are comfortable and rejecting the bits that are uncomfortable? And doesn't the Bible itself warn against taking that kind of attitude? So am I actually in a safe place? And if I go down the road of picking only the bits that are comfortable to me, and I acknowledge that I'm a fallible person, I don't know what's true and don't know what's not true, then you can pretty much guarantee that whatever package I end up with, a significant chunk is going to be wrong. And And if I don't know which bits are wrong, and I have no way of knowing which bits are wrong, then what's the issue with just rejecting all of it? And so at some point I got to that question. I went, oh, can I? Is that an okay? And that was a really unsettling place to be, to actually say that to yourself. And again, I don't know, I can't remember exactly where in this 3-year process that actual thought went. Obviously it was towards the end, but I can't tell you in all honesty how far from the end that was. But I think once I'd asked myself that question, I think to all intents and purposes, it was game over. I just needed to accept it, that it was game over. And I didn't like it. That kind of letting go of God was a difficult thing to do, because it meant that letting go of God meant that I had to rethink awful lot of things. You know, the whole morality coming from God, for example, you know, which I'd been fed on from a very young child. You only know to be good because God's there, got his spirit in you, because you believe in God. You only know what's the right thing to do. That kind of, and the Holy Spirit dwelling within us gives us guidance, and that kind of thing had been fed to me constantly, you know, from a very young child. And I had to work out how I was going to do that, because if I said no to God, it meant that I had to make I had to accept the position that all of these things were me. And when all you've had in your life is you've got supernatural guidance in making decisions, you know, you pray before you apply for a job, for example, or you pray before you relocate to a different town, and you pray before you choose a new church to go to, all those kinds of things. It was suddenly, I'm not going to do any of those things anymore. And it's quite I want to say unsettling, but it's not really the right word. It's a strange place to be when you realize all of these things that you're used to. It's like a blanket that's been around you for your entire life. And you're suddenly at a point where, you know what, actually, it feels like I should take this off, but you don't know what it feels like to take it off. It was, I hope the metaphor works for those who are listening, but it was a really strange place to be. But then eventually, and this is a moment that I remember, I was walking back home from doing a shopping trip in town, and I was just going through these things one more time. And they'd been going through my mind for weeks and for weeks. And I thought, you need to decide, Matthew, you need to decide that your mindset during all of this isn't going to work. You know, it's one way or the other. And I said, okay, it's a no then. And it was just like, suddenly it was like, yeah, I'm free. And it was really odd. And I felt it was like a weight was lifted. And I appreciate that the Christians aren't going to like that metaphor coming, but it really was how I felt. And I felt like I was walking a little bit taller in that moment, because all of that questioning and all of that doubting over those 3 years, it takes a toll. And when you decide, right, I'm done. And it wasn't a sudden decision. You know, the sudden was the realization that this is what I'd got to. And yeah, and it was freedom of, I'm free, I'm liberated, life is great, I'm not going to be struck down by lightning, and I'm still not going to go out and murder anybody, and it's wonderful. And so basically that's where I got there. It's a real rocket ship story through. I don't know how long that took me, but happy to take any questions or any details on that. I'll just note as a quick thing, actually, we talked about this off air, so I'll go and answer it straight away. Actually, there is obviously the question of my wife and what happened about that. I would like to say that there was a lot of fear through going through this process, because what I haven't said is also going through this process, I did read quite a lot of blogs from people who'd been through a similar process to me. So I'd read a lot of blogs. I got involved in a bit of a blogging community of people who'd done that. And what I'd noticed was there's a very, very high attrition rate of marriages where one partner deconverts and the other one stays. And that world was a world full of pain for the people that experienced that. And I was terrified of that happening, utterly terrified. I didn't want to do that. And a phrase that I've said, I think it was on the Graceful Atheist podcast where I told my story. I said, I tried not to hurt the person I cared about the most by being quiet about it, but it comes out, and in being quiet about it, I hurt the person who I care about the most. So I would like to say, if anyone's listening, don't do what I did. I did do the wrong thing, and I should have been open about it. I should have shared my concerns with my wife. It was probably the single biggest mistake I made in the whole of that. And I want to acknowledge and not hide away from that. It was a rotten mistake to make. I denied my wife the shared journey with me, regardless of what was going to happen. And it was another couple of years before she actually found out. I was, when she did eventually find out, I was actually surprised that she hadn't worked it out. So that came out as a bit of a shock. So I'll stop there. I've talked for long enough. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It seems to me that the primary issues that were of concern to you as you deconstructed your faith were the sleep paralysis issue, for one, being a natural explanation for what you had interpreted previously as being some sort of demonic spiritual attack. Secondly, becoming aware of the fact that young Earth creationism doesn't stand up to intellectual scientific scrutiny, and so you had concerns in regards to how to best interpret the early chapters of Genesis, and especially the historicity of Adam and Eve and the theological downstream impact that might have on the mission of Jesus of Nazareth and so forth. And third, the fact that we have miracles reported in Scripture and the inability to accept miraculous accounts. Is that a fair summary of the main issues?
That's probably it. I would probably add more weight to the evidentialist and young Earth creationist side. But like I say, it was 15 years ago, and I have to be honest, I'm a little bit fuzzy on what was important to me then. I would imagine that what I would report as important now might not necessarily match what was important then, but I think you have hit the key issues, because certainly one person who knows me well and I care about, their first question to me when I told them was, well, what about that deliverance experience? So that certainly is a key thing, and that was certainly something that I had to answer. And I think, you're right.
Sure. And I personally might realize this if you've listened to any of my other interviews or discussions online, that I tend to be naturally skeptical personally of personal subjective experiences. I prefer to search for natural explanations before I infer a supernatural cause. That's just the way I'm wired. So when one asks me why I believe Christianity to be true, my answer to that is that I believe solely on the basis of the public evidence as I understand it. So I personally find the evidence for, let's say, the resurrection, which you and I have talked about before at length, I find that to be a compelling reason to believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be, and so forth, and that is God's vindication of Jesus' messianic and divine credentials. Let's start maybe with the young Earth creationist thing. So I, as you probably know, I'm not a young Earth creationist. I think that there's overwhelming evidence that the Earth and the universe are very, very ancient. And I even think that there is some good evidence for common descent. I think that you can make a good case for common descent from the scientific evidence. I'm more skeptical of the sufficiency of natural processes, chance, physical necessity, or natural selection, being constantly sufficient to explain the complexity and diversity and design that we see all around us.
Right.
What was it, though, about the rejection of young restorationism that caused you to, in turn, reject the historicity of a robust Adam and Eve?
It was purely the common, yeah, it would effectively be humans are descended from what is essentially a common ancestor between us and the other apes. So it would be that. So my understanding of evolution is that there was never actually a first human. It was, we evolved from what came before. So actually identifying an individual who could be the first human is effectively impossible. And also the knowledge that once we have got identifiable humans, the population of humans was never particularly low. It might have been down as low as thousands or tens of thousands, but it is not anticipated that it was low as hundreds. So certainly down to a couple is highly, highly improbable. So it was a combination of those two things makes a single couple not really viable. If they existed, they either existed. There's two options that I've heard of Adam and Eve existing. One would be a God-ordained couple as part of the existing population. And the other one is, I think it's one that Joshua Somodar says, where there was an existing human population and they were created and literally plonked into the Garden of Eden alongside these existing humans, and they effectively bred into them. I'm not sure how we could validate either of those options scientifically. So beyond a way of being able to test for them, I don't see why they should be taken any more seriously than interesting ideas.
Okay, so I'm not as convinced that the population genetics data necessarily precludes the possibility of there being a primordial couple. I do think that it does if you place that primordial couple within the past 100,000 years. But I think if you are prepared to go further back than that, I think that there are population genetic models which are consistent with a primordial pair that we're all descended from. But let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that you're correct. I think that the reason why many people consider Adam and Eve to be incompatible with the idea of common ancestry is not common ancestry per se, but rather gradualism. The idea that there's never a first human per se on the evolutionary scenario, in the same way that it's very difficult to quantify how many hairs it takes on a human face to qualify as a beard, right? We recognize the beard when we see one, but it's not let you get one more hair, now you have a beard when you didn't previously, right? And likewise, when an adolescent becomes an adult, there's not a defined day. I mean, we might say
that's my favorite analogy, that one there. Yes.
Yeah,
which day did my teenager become an adult? Yeah, quite.
Yeah, it's fairly arbitrary. You won't say it's an 18th birthday, but it's a convention. It's a very gradual thing, and likewise on a gradualist scenario, there's no first human per se. It's all on a continuum.
Yeah.
However, if you accept the premise, as I do, that life exhibits unmistakable hallmarks of design, and that natural processes of chance and physical necessity are demonstrably insufficient to explain the appearance of design that we observe in biology, and that the time scales that are allowed for the chimp-like ancestor to human transition are just far too short based on population genetics analysis for natural selection to be the best explanation, to be an adequate explanation, then that opens the door for moving away from that gradualistic scenario to embrace a more saltationist view. And once you start, so for instance, you could envision that God created humans using a previous organism's genome as a template, for example, which would result in the same sort of nested hierarchical distribution that we predict on common descent. Now, one might say that that's ad hoc. However, I think that that is less of a concern if you recognize, as I do, that that naturalistic processes are inadequate to explain the A to B transition, then I think that it's legitimate to consider whether there are any alternative scenarios to that gradualistic paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Where would I go with that? Yeah, there's a couple of points I would think on that. I think probably the first thing I would say is under an evolutionary model, where what works best is more likely to be inherited by the next generation. What we're going to get to after not many generations is something that looks designed for the environment that it's in. So I'm very happy to accept that the evolutionary model will end up with something that people are quite happy to interpret as design. And sorry, excuse me. So I have no issue with people looking at things and saying that looks design. Yeah, it may do, but how do we test that it is? And I'm sure you've heard this one before, but for people who believe that God created everything and that therefore everything is designed by God, how do you differentiate design from non-design when everything is effectively designed? We probably don't need to go down that road. The one that I would stick with is, natural selection and evolution will end up with something that works in its environment and de facto looks designed. So I just don't see an issue with that. So I don't see it being a problem.
Okay, sure. So just a few points there. Let's circle around first of all to the issue of Adam and Eve. So even if you have an initial population that's more than two individuals, let's say 10,000 individuals, what have you, and let's say that they are created de novo by God, by divine fiat, as opposed to a gradual scenario. Now that doesn't preclude that their genome has been synthesized using a previous organism's genome as a template. That's a possible view, I think. So let's suppose that we have an initial population, and you have Adam and Eve within that initial population, that founding population, who serve as kind of the representatives, the tribal representative of that population. So you've got this corporate representation scenario where Adam and Eve serve as the first priest and priestess of mankind. That, I think, salvages the traditional understanding of Adam and Eve, even without an initial primordial couple, where Adam and Eve are still. And it also takes care of certain issues like where did Cain get his wife and so forth without getting into incestuous issues. It also takes care of so in Genesis 4, where you have Cain being concerned that someone's going to find him and kill him. Well, who's there? There's no other people. It also takes care of, well, who's he building a city with in Genesis 4 and so forth. So, there seems to be, at least it's not conclusive, but there are suggestive clues in scripture that there may also be other people around at the time. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for a Christian to suggest tentatively that one possible model is that Adam and Eve are the representatives, the tribal representatives of the founding population of mankind, which I think, would that be a legitimate perspective from your viewpoint?
Yes. Let's assume you've got me to a point where I accept there's a God again. That would certainly be an option. And I suspect that if I was to go back into Christianity, that's probably an idea that I would find very attractive. But I'm not there, so I haven't got the preconditions required to accept that as a proposal. But certainly I see how it fits. The pushback I would want to give on that idea is it's an idea that's trying to fit a narrative rather than evidence. Let's explain the evidence. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think it's going back about it the wrong way. It's starting from the Genesis narrative and saying, okay, well, let's just accept on face value that that's the truth. Now, what story can we retrospectively give to humanity to fit into that? I'd rather see some archaeological evidence found, some bones saying, oh, this descendant couple have got DNA that's different to what we see from humans who have come from the common ancestry tree. Why is this the case? Is there a way that we can explain this or something like that? Or that kind of thing would genuinely be a problem for me if that kind of evidence came out, and because then we would have evidence where there's a narrative that could actually fit that physical evidence, and the standard evolutionary model would probably struggle to explain that. So I would like to see that kind of evidence trickle down, and then we go, okay, we've worked out what that is from the evidence that we found. It's this building into it from the wrong direction, which I quibble with a little bit.
Okay, sure, that's fair. So here, just a few comments. So before I address that particular point, let's circle back to one thing you said in your previous remarks, where you said that in order to make the argument for design in biology, we have to find a way of distinguishing between design and not design. So if and this is, I think, is a problem with an argument that is sometimes ill-advisedly put forward by the likes of Ray Comfort, that we know that a painting requires a painter, therefore a creation requires a creator. Yeah. And of course, as you know, that begs the question, because yes, the whole debate is this a creation that we're actually living in, right?
Yeah.
And if the whole universe is a painting, then how do we know it's a painting? Because there's nothing to distinguish it from. Yeah. There's no non-painting that we could compare it to. Yeah. No point of contrast. And I completely agree with that critique of this kind of a Ray Comfort style approach to making that case. However, I think you can make a more nuanced argument for design by recognizing, as I do, that not everything is designed, and that, for example, I don't think the Grand Canyon is designed. I don't think God chiseled out the Grand Canyon, right? I think it's the product of chance and necessity. Right. Likewise, snowflakes. I don't think God's up in heaven cutting up with a pair of scissors, the snowflake.
He's got better things to do with his time.
Exactly. These are the products of natural law, chance and physical necessity, right? And we can distinguish, I think, between things which are the products of mind and conscious deliberative agency, and those which are the product of physical necessity and chance, because by virtue of the possession of a semiotic dimension or complex specified information that is characteristic of design systems and not characteristic of non-design systems. For example, when you read a book, we know that it's a product of design, because the letters spell out meaningful sentences and meaningful paragraphs, and we recognize that there's a higher level objective which is accomplished by the working together of the numerous letters which are arranged in a particular way in order to spell out a meaning. And I think that when we look at biological systems, we see information content that is intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, that DNA spells out a code which is transcribed into messenger RNA, and then at the ribosome that gets translated into another language, namely protein language, or amino acids that spell out the instructions for folding a protein into its three-dimensional structure based on the properties of the side chains of those amino acids. Now, I realize this is your expertise, so don't worry about giving a comprehensive rebuttal to the design argument. But do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I do. And yeah, this is a little bit above my pay grade in terms of the knowledge that probably this is definitely an area where I'd need to defer to the experts. And obviously the obvious question then is, well, which experts do you trust? Obviously I believe the evolutionary experts who say that this appears to have evolved from more primitive form, like we had RNA before, and then we had DNA, and that they're working on how RNA may have come about, what sugars or whatever it was that the prefix that. Yeah, I much prefer looking at the stars than looking at what's at the other end of a microscope. So my interest is much more in the stars, the evolution of stars, the formation of planets, and those kinds of things. I defer to the vast majority of biologists in the arena who say that they're happy that this evolved and it wasn't created. Probably the other thing I would say, actually, which I think is probably will probably be the more important thing from my perspective, is if, let's say for argument's sake, there is a God and God is the source of everything that we've got, then I would want to see the evidence that there's a God behind it in all the bits that matter. So if we leave the RNA and DNA for just for a moment and go to the stars and go to the universe, now we've got really fairly good models of the expansion of the universe and how solar systems form, etc. I understand that those sort of things better, and protoplanetary disks and all that, and that happens really well. And we've got physics that explains that really well, because I've had one of the arguments that I've had with somebody else is, our moons around planets all fall into a really ordered pattern. I go, well, of course they do. It's basic physics. After millions of years of orbiting an object, the orbiting rocks and moons are going to be in a pattern, because if they're not in a stable pattern, they'll self-destruct, or the physics will destroy them, or they'll get flung out. So you will end up with a nice pattern. So I get that, and I understand it. It looks pretty, and I understand why people at first sight might say, well, that must have been put there, but actually we understand the physics behind it. So we can rule out, arrogantly, rule out design there. And then if we go to common descent, etc., the theory of evolution, I accept, explains really well, features. I know there's a little bit of disagreement from you in that, but it works. So, and again, we don't need design for mutations coming in. We don't need to see something creating a mutation. We understand how mutations happen, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And we don't see the obvious design in that either. So if the outlier is RNA and DNA, and we don't have let's say we just don't have a good explanation for that, so the conclusion is it must be done. Why is it only there? Surely I would want to see, if God has created everything, I would want to see that problem in RNA and DNA, and I want to see that problem in planetary formation, and I would want to see that problem in galaxy formation, and I'd want to see that problem in diversification of species, and I'd want to see it everywhere. And I think if it only comes out in one point, then maybe the reason why it only comes out in one point is we just don't have a good explanation naturally for that point, and we're going to get there. But I don't see why that should drive the designer of everything else. Have I explained myself well there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it follows that if we have certain features of the world that exhibit evidence of design, that all features of the world should exhibit evidence of design. I'm not sure that follows, but I would argue that, well, first of all, you want to defer to the experts, which is fine, but most origin of life researchers would admit, I think, that the origin of life research is at an impasse, right? And so there is no good currently explanation for the origins of the first life, the origins of the first RNA polymers, the origins of the first protein structures, and so forth. How do you explain the origins of DNA replication with all of its different components that need to work together? How do you even get from an RNA to a DNA world, DNA protein world? No one really knows the answers to those questions. And then I would argue that there are many macromolecular machines which seem to defy explanation by natural selection, random mutation, the origins of protein structures, which seem to be extraordinarily rare within sequence space. I would refer you to Douglas Axe's work on that topic, although there's other research as well, though Axe most notably on the rarity of amino acid sequences forming stable and functional protein structures. And then you've also got the issue of population genetics and so the fossil record gives you a pretty good handle on how much time you have to accomplish A to B transitions in the history of life. So for instance, the human chimp divergence is thought to have happened around 6 million years ago. And there was a paper published in the Journal of Genetics 2008 by Rick Dewart and Dina Schmidt, who are two mathematicians. And they basically presented a population genetics model where, and these are mainstream guys, they're not intelligent design theorists, but they were doing a population genetics model looking at how much time it would take for two-step mutation to arise in a transcription factor binding site And according to their myth, in a hominid population, bearing in mind that until very recently, the size of the hominid population, the effective or the breeding population size was something like 20,000 individuals per generation. And they calculated that it would require about 216 million years for that to occur in a hominid population. Whereas if you actually look at the fossil record, you have 6 million years. So, and that's just for a two-step coordinated mutation, never mind the entire transition. You could look at the whale series, for example, which is a very very kind of the flagship example of an evolutionary transition in the fossil record, is going from a land-dwelling terrestrial mammal, Pagacetus, down to Dorodon Basilosaurus, which are fully aquatic whales in a period of about 9 million years, if you take the most generous estimate of the fossil record, how much time that you have to accomplish that transition. But when you look at the sorts of anatomical changes that are required, you need substantial reduction of the hind limbs. The forelimbs have to be transformed into flippers. You need a ball vertebra instead of a sacral vertebra, because the tail, instead of wagging side to side like a dog's tail, has to move up and down. You need a special lung surfactant, because in whales diving come back to the surface, the lung needs to re-expand very quickly. You need reorganization of kidney tissue for intake of salt water. You have to have reorientation of the fetus for giving birth underwater. You have to have modification of the mammary glands for nursing young underwater. It's just on. And one of the most remarkable changes is the need for an intra-abdominal current heat system, because in whales, unlike in most mammals, where the testes are actually hanging outside the body, and if the testes fail to descend, you get sterility. In whales, the testes are actually inside the body, right next to the muscles generating heat during swimming. And so you have to actively cool down the gland, which is done in a manner similar to a modern refrigeration system by effectively shunting cooled blood from the tail flukes to a nexus of arteries and veins that dissipates heat from the gland. So basically, the testes are bathed in cooled blood and kept below core body temperature. Now, if we imagine that just 2 mutations are necessary to accomplish that transition, where you have the testes inside the body and that elaborate intra-abdominal current heat exchange system, Richard Sternberg, who's an evolutionary biologist, basically modified the equations of the Jordan Schmidt paper to accommodate for the fact that we're dealing with more individuals and so forth. And according to his calculation, for that transition, for that two-step coordinated mutation, where we just need 2 mutations that are by themselves non-adaptive, but adaptive when taken in combination, would require something like 43.4 million years for that to occur. But if you look at the fossil record, you've only got 9 million years for the entire transition to occur. So I would argue that it just doesn't add up mathematically. And I realize this is your expertise, but this is kind of where I'm coming from and why I tend to have skepticism, at least, although I think that there's evidence for common descent. I think that I think it's important to distinguish between the pattern of common descent or hereditary continuity and the process which purports to explain that pattern. Because common descent wasn't something that was new with Darwin, right? You can find that going back to the ancient Greeks. What was new with Darwin was the idea that natural selection coupled with chance mutation, or we didn't know what mutations were at the time, but chance variations, could explain the appearance of design without recourse to a designing intelligence. And so demonstrating common descent doesn't actually show you that. It only shows that organisms are related by descent and doesn't actually tell you anything about the cause of evolutionary change over time. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. If I've understood you right, it's one individual who's calculated these years. So I guess the obvious question is, how do we know his maths is correct? And I obviously don't know anything about his work to be able to critique that specifically. One thing which did have a big impact on me when I was going through this questioning phase was I spent a period of time working at the Natural History Museum in London, creating an IT system for them. I'm a software developer by trade. And while I was working there, they had an exhibition, which I think is called The Inside Out. Basically, what it is in summary is many of the animals around on Earth are effectively they've got formaldehyde or something similar injected into their veins after they've died, obviously, and so that you get their blood system plasticized, and then the body is dissolved away in acid. So what you're left with is a skeleton and this plasticized diagram of all the blood vessels, and then these specimens are hung up. And I was walking around this mesmerized, because when you go to the tiniest shrew, and you go to the bats, and then you go to the apes, and you go to the elephants, and you go to the whales, and you can see they're all mammals. The structural similarities in terms of the skeletons, where the muscle points are, key parts of the blood system. And it was one of those revolutionary moments for me, where I took a step forward. And so there is absolute commonality. And then when you compare the mammals to the not mammals, you can see where there's differences. So certainly on the whole point of the whales, whales belong to that same family as on land mammals. When you just look at what you've got there, it's really, really hard to question it. And then, of course, you couple that with the knowledge that, and I believe I'm accurate in saying that the whale and the hippo are very, very close genetically. When you map their DNA, they are close cousins. Maybe even the hippo is the closest cousin to the whale that we've got. So again, there is something there. So there's very definitely a strong hint of a land mammal or a semi-aquatic land mammal moving into the ocean, or did it go the other way, whichever. So there are definitely pointers and indicators there that there's something going on. So I certainly think that it's a sound conclusion to come to based on the evidence that we've got. Obviously, the time is challenged, and I can't speak to the time. The challenge is to work out how it happened rather than did it happen.
Yeah, and I'm not contesting that it happened. I'm not contesting that the A to B transitions that we observe in the history of life happened historically.
Yeah.
So I'm not rejecting the idea of common descent per se.
The question is, did God help it along?
Yeah, I think that there are points in the history of life where there are infusions of information into the biosphere, and I'm not suggesting the sort of tinkerer hypothesis, where there's every few generations there's just a tinkering with the DNA.
That would be hard to measure, I think.
Yeah, I'm suggesting that there are points in the history of life, such as the Cambrian explosion and other events in the history of life, where there is infusion of information into the biosphere, such that you have these radically new forms of life emerge, and even possibly God may have used the genomes of previous organisms as a template for the synthesis of new forms of life. I don't rule that out. And one, as I said before, one might argue that hypothesis is ad hoc, but I think that is less of a concern if we have independent reason to believe, as I think we do, that there is design going on and that naturalistic processes are inadequate to explain the complexity of life. But I did want to circle back to the other point you raised earlier, which is about, so I talked about Adam and Eve and the scenarios that might work or hold traction in regards to subscribing to a robust view of Adam and Eve. And your objection was that seems to you to be ad hoc, because it seems that we are adhering to the theory first and then looking for a way to make the data fit. And it is absolutely correct that we want to avoid just trying to make the data fit, because making your theory consistent with the evidence is not the same thing as showing that your theory is confirmed by the evidence, and also not the same thing as showing that your theory is not disconfirmed by the evidence. Because you can make all manner of things consistent with the evidence. And you may have seen Stephen Law has a great lecture on this, where he talks about his theory that dogs are actually invaders from the planet Venus, and he makes all the data. You've seen that? He makes all.
Something's ringing a bell about that. I'm going to have to look it up now.
Okay.
If I've been exposed to it, it was a while ago, but something is ringing a bell.
It's funny. He manages to make all the data consistent with it, but it's still
awesome.
A disconfirmed theory, right? So
why dogs and not cats? Surely cats would be the more obvious one to pick for that.
But so yeah, I agree with you in principle. However, I think that if we can show, and I realize that this is the premise on which we will disagree, but if we accept the premise, as I do, that that Jesus of Nazareth really is who he said he was. He rose from the dead, and he's the Messiah, Israel's Messiah, and divine and so forth. Then his testimony is itself indirect evidence, such that things that he testifies to be true should that should be taken as at least a prima facie basis for believing that to be so, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. You need to get me over the hurdle of why I should believe that, but it makes sense.
But in principle, you could make the argument that way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't. So I would make a distinction between direct evidence and indirect evidence. That I would concede that we don't have any direct evidence for Adam and Eve, but I think that if we accept the premise Jesus rose from the dead, and therefore Jesus claims to be Israel's Messiah and the divine Son of God are substantiated, then that provides some indirect evidence, which could in principle be overturned. I mean, it's a two-way thing. So evidence against Adam and Eve could also in principle undermine that, because it could lower the prior probability. But in the same way, Jesus' resurrection, the evidence bearing on that could raise the prior probability of an historical Adam and Eve, which then could provide a reasonable, rational motivation for looking for explanations of how an historical Adam and Eve could actually fit with the data, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good transition to talk about your third primary objection that you talked about in your testimony about the historicity of miracles, and how would we justify the miraculous aspects of the text. Do you want to go that direction? Or?
Yeah, we can do. It basically boils down to I don't know how we could know is the real thing. And certainly for somebody who believes in God and then believes that Jesus is who he said he was, i.e. the Son of God, I understand why miracles are not a difficult thing to believe in that. And the hurdle you have with me is that you can't get me to God through those miracles, because if I don't already believe in God, I've got no reason to take the miracles seriously. So again, it's probably the wrong direction to go with me. I would need to accept first that there's a mechanism by which miracles could occur in order for miracles to occur. And so I would probably default to something like either it was a mistaken account or the people who wrote it can't be trusted. Probably one of those two. And I think if I'm really honest, you would have a difficult time getting me off one of those two plates. Get me to believing in God first.
Sure.
and then the miracles will be easier to follow.
So let me challenge you on. So I think you've got this backwards.
Okay.
So let me give you an analogy to help explain why I think you might have this backwards. Let's suppose that I subscribe to the hypothesis that Matthew Taylor exists. Okay. How much does that raise the prior probability that I will receive an email from Matthew Taylor tomorrow? Not much. A little bit, but not much.
Okay.
On the other hand, let's say that I receive an email from someone who identifies himself as Matthew Taylor tomorrow. And let's say I didn't have prior knowledge that you existed. How much does that raise the prior probability that a guy called Matthew Taylor exists? Well, it raises it quite a lot. So
unless it's a scammer, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's still, that doesn't happen very often. I don't receive emails much from scammers, and people who identify themselves as a particular individual generally turn out to be that individual.
Yeah.
So it raises the probability quite a bit that a guy called Matthew Taylor exists. Yeah. So likewise, I would argue that if God exists, that if we demonstrate that God exists, let's say through the Kalam argument, the fine-tuning argument, biological design arguments, and so forth, let's say that we accept the premise God exists, then it only slightly increases the prior probability that Jesus is going to be raised from the dead, any more than it raises the probability that I'm going to be raised from the dead, or that you're going to be raised from the dead, right? But if we have direct evidence that Jesus of Nazareth really did rise from the dead, and that the best explanation seems to be that the God of Israel has raised Jesus from the dead, then that raises the prior probability that God exists quite a lot, right? So do you see where I'm coming from there?
I do. Yeah. Obviously, we're working on the assumption that those events actually happened, and I think that's where the problem is. I think the UFO phenomena is probably a better analogy than the email phenomena. You know, there are a great many people who report seeing UFOs. You know, but is there any likelihood that alien spacecraft have actually entered our atmosphere? Yeah, I would strongly suggest that it's zero on that, and it's far more likely that people claiming to see UFOs are either mistaken or fraudulent. But let's go off let's leave the intentional fraudulent way. That can leave a bad taste. Let's just say that they're either misinformed or mistaken.
Yeah, and I'm perfectly happy to consider the hypothesis of fraud as well. And I think you probably agree with me that that when anyone makes any sort of claim, there are three and only three competing explanations or categories, broad categories of explanation for why that claim is being made. One is that they're actually true, that the claim's true. One is that they're honestly mistaken somehow, and one is that they lied about it, right? I don't think there are any other categories of explanation beyond that. These are mutually exhaustive.
Well, would somebody else lying about it come under the factor of them lying about it?
Yeah, so if we know that the person actually made the claim, so yeah, so you could say, for example, that taking the analogy to the Gospels, we could say that someone decades later claimed that this is what the apostles said, for example.
Yeah.
But if we accept the premise that the apostles did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead, then we can argue that one of those three contending explanations has to be correct, I think. And so let me see whether you would accept the structure of the argument in principle, even if you might disagree with the premises. So if we were to say that, if we were to show convincingly that the resurrection encounters, as reported by the gospel accounts, goes back to those original apostolic eyewitnesses, then one of the following three hypotheses is true. Either Jesus rose from the dead, the apostles somehow mistakenly came to believe Jesus rose from the dead, or they deliberately lied that Jesus had risen from the dead. The nature of their claims makes it enormously improbable that they were honestly mistaken about it, because when you look at the claims of the gospel records, they purport that Jesus appeared not just to individuals, but to groups of individuals, that they were polymodal, involving multiple sensory modes. They involved physical contact with Jesus. They involved group conversations with Jesus. They involved Thomas requesting to see the prints of the nails and spear print from his side. They involve eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. These things are very difficult to be honestly mistaken about, right? They involve long discourses with Jesus. According to Acts 1, it was extending across a 40-day time period. So these things are very difficult to be honestly wrong about. And so that's enormously improbable. And then really the two remaining contending hypotheses are Jesus rose from the dead, or they deliberately lied about it. And the circumstances of the testimony of the apostles makes it, in my opinion, quite improbable that they were lying about it. And you know the argument that the apostles seem to have been willing to die and suffer persecution and immense suffering as a result of their testimony, which is quite a bit more probable given the hypothesis of sincerity than given its falsehood. And then you've got the fact that they use women witnesses as primary discoverers of the empty tomb and so forth, which is, again, more probable given that this is what they really believed and falsehood of that, and so forth. And so do you see how such an argument could be wielded if you accept the premises? Yes?
Yeah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, on the assumption that the premises are true. Yeah, I don't see how I could disagree with that.
Okay, so if it were shown that the gospel, that the claim about the resurrection in the gospel accounts, that goes back to the original apostles, would you think that the case for the resurrection were strong?
If I was convinced that it came from them, then yeah, probably. I don't know what other things would have to fall into place. I'm trying to work out how I'm going to express this. I've still got the issue of believing in God, and so there's kind of a double-edged sword thing going on here in my mind. And certainly, if you can get me to believe in God, that's based on the assumption that the apostle, those narratives come from the apostles themselves. It becomes much easier to believe.
But
trying to convince me of that when I don't already believe in God is too easy for me to come up with other objections to reject it.
But wouldn't the evidence for the resurrection itself be evidence for God?
I wouldn't, not primary, because humans being humans, they have written extraordinary stories. And before we went on to recording, we were talking about some of the extraordinary things that humans can believe, and we were sharing and express exasperation at some things that humans are prepared to believe, which we just don't appreciate. So it's way too easy to say, yeah, some people either believed some weird stuff or they wrote some weird stuff. And without... And so with the background of humans writing and believing weird stuff, this is a weird stuff which can easily go into that pile and be lost in the annals of human literary history. It doesn't get me to the supernatural being of God. I don't think it even gets me onto the step.
So that would be a consideration in terms of estimating the prior probability, right? So you would say that generally, when we encounter what you consider to be weird stuff being testified to, it turns out to be false, and so likely this one also will turn out to be false, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
That's a legitimate consideration to bring to the table. In the same way that we might say that if we have a lottery and the lottery commissioner's son wins the lottery, it doesn't prove that something happened, but it seems that there's a little bit of some evidence that something's amiss, because in cases where that happens, it typically is the case that there's some sort of cheating going on, right?
Yeah.
So that's a fair thing to bring to the table. But there are also other, I would argue, considerations which can raise the prior probability of the resurrection. So I would argue. So I actually disagree with Carl Sagan and yourself, because I know you subscribe to this, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I have an essay on my website where I deal with it in quite a bit of detail. But one of the critiques I would make of that is, let's suppose that we take any old Joe Blow who's died. The probability that God would raise him from the dead, even supposing God exists, is astronomically small, right? Because we've got so many people that have died, and it seems that none of them, or almost none of them, depending on your view of the resurrection of Jesus, and Lazarus and people, but none of them, or almost none of them, have ever come back from the dead. And so given that someone has died, it's enormously improbable that they're going to be raised from the dead. And I completely accept that. I do think it follows from that, though, that the prior probability of Jesus of Nazareth specifically rising from the dead is equally low. And when we look at the messianic prophecy, for example, if we accept the premise that Jesus fulfills messianic prophecy from the Old Testament, that provides a basis for thinking plausibly God has motivation for raising Jesus of Nazareth specifically from the dead. Also, if we accept the trilemma argument that C.S. Lewis put forward, which basically says that, okay, so if Jesus claimed to be God incarnate, which I think there's a good historical argument that he did, that's something that's very difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And he seems to be insincere, given the fact that he got himself crucified for it. So that raises the probability of him actually being correct, and that in turn raises the probability of it increases the interior probability of the resurrection also. So do you see how there are ways of raising the probability in Jesus' case, at least in principle?
I guess so, but we've got this basic disagreement on how much evidence is required to believe a claim. And for me, a resurrection claim is quite a big one. I made reference right to the beginning that I grew up in Zambia. In some rural parts of those cultures, you can hear some really, really strange stories. And one example of a story that I heard as a teenager was somebody, my dad had his own company building houses at one point in Zambia. And at one point, one of his employees told me, in all seriousness, that he could go to a witch doctor who could put him in a trance, and when he woke up, he'd be in London. And the way this guy was telling me about it, it seemed quite clear that he believed it. Obviously, I didn't. To get to London required quite an expensive plane ticket and a 9-hour flight. There was no way I was going to believe that a witch doctor in a hut could magic me to London, by smoking something. It might be quite a trip, but I don't think it'll be a London-bound trip. And I couldn't imagine any kind, well, short of an actual demonstration, I can't really imagine any ways in which I could accept that had any kind of truth in it. And so accepting an ancient, 2,000-year-old resurrection, where I haven't even got the ability of somebody telling me firsthand about it, let alone the ability to try to test it out, it's that kind of category of thing. So it's genuinely a really hard fence for me to climb to accept that kind of thing as being probable at all. So I've lost you.
Sorry, I was muted. I apologize. So presumably, there is some level of evidence that could, in principle, persuade you of these things, right?
It's hard when it's a 2,000-year-old single event. It's, I mean, even a mundane thing, where someone says it happened and it's easily believable, it's still hard to think how it can be shown to be true. Somebody rode on a donkey between two cities. Yeah, okay, possibly. If you're going to tell me a specific individual with a specific name on a specific day 2,000 years ago did that journey, well, maybe, but I don't know. I don't know how I could believe it to be an absolute certainty. And I think that's why I know you're not trying to say absolute certainty, but I don't know how we could extract 2,000-year-old evidence for an event like that. So it's almost like it's an impasse, because I just don't know how I could get there, which is why I said, get me to a point where I'm accepting that God exists, then suddenly believing these things will become an awful lot easier for me. In my current skeptical state of mind, I don't know what there is evidence-wise that could get me to entertain it as a viable event.
So Charles Babbage, who's a 19th century philosopher and mathematician, wrote that, and I quote, "If independent witnesses can be found to speak the truth more frequently than falsehood, it is always possible to assign a number of independent witnesses the improbability of the falsehood of whose concurring testimonies should be greater than that of the improbability of the miracle itself," end quote. And I think that's totally right, that no matter how improbable a miracle might be, as long as it's not zero, there is a certain number of testimonies which would be sufficient to overcome that initial improbability of the miracle claim itself. Would you accept that in principle?
I'm not sure, because even if somebody is shown to be a reliable person on mundane or even slightly out of the way things, if they come out with something that's outlandish, should I believe that based on the fact that they didn't lie to me about mundane things? It's a really hard place to go, and probably the best illustration I can show you of that is one of my grandfathers. He was a man of God, and to my knowledge, he never lied in his entire life. It's possible, as I certainly wasn't aware of them. He was a wonderful man. He died 24 years ago. I still miss him. I can still picture him. I absolutely loved spending my teenage years with him. I consider it a treasure that he was old enough to see me get married. Sorry that he died. But anyway, you know what I mean. But he told me this anecdote, and let's assume I'm remembering it correctly. He told me this anecdote that he was born in a room that overlooked the Taj Mahal in India. Now, it's possible that he said he lived or visited a room where he could see the Taj Mahal out the window, but my memory says he was born in it. But let's not quibble about which one of those it was. That's the event. And so I carried this story with me for years. I was like, why would my granddad ever make up a story like this? You know, it's not the sort of thing that he would make something up about. And so I believed this for years. Eventually, I had an opportunity to find out where he was born. And he was born in India, but he was born in Ambala, which is hundreds of miles away from where the Taj Mahal is. So the anecdote, as I remembered it, was blatantly false. But of course, he'd already died by the time that I found this out. So I could never dig in to find out the truth of it. So me believing that story, because my grandfather was always a trustworthy, reliable person, was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And it's this kind of thing. I don't mind. I don't care. That sounds that sounds a bit provocative, but yeah, I'm not sure that the previous reliability on mundane things is necessarily a good thing for something that's less mundane.
So I think that it is epistemically relevant, and here's why. So if the gospel accounts can be shown to be correct on minor peripheral mundane things that would be difficult to get right unless the writer was an eyewitness or someone who spoke to eyewitnesses, then if we can build a cumulative case where we have dozens and dozens and dozens of these examples, then that provides, I think, a robust case that the authors of the Gospels and Acts are individuals who are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually reliable and trustworthy and truthful. And that is directly relevant to the resurrection, because if the resurrection claims that are given to us in the Gospels actually go back to the eyewitnesses, then we have to explain why they make the claims that we find in the Gospels, which includes the multisensory nature and character of the resurrection appearances and their extension across 40 days and so forth, the long discourses of Jesus following his resurrection, which are very difficult to explain on the hypothesis of being honestly mistaken. And furthermore, interestingly, Jesus returns from the dead on the Sunday, right? That's is interesting. 1 Corinthians 15 mentions that Christ was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and scholars debate as to exactly what it means, because where's that third day motif in the Old Testament, right? We have reference to the resurrection in the Old Testament, but there's no obvious reference to it being on the third day specifically. And in that same chapter in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul refers to Christ being the first fruits from among the dead, or for those that have fallen asleep, which harks back to Leviticus 23, where you had the first fruits feast, where the Israelites would celebrate the first fruits of the harvest, being the guarantor that the rest of the harvest would also be delivered. And the fact that Christ is raised and that was to be celebrated according to Leviticus 23 on the day following the first Sabbath following Passover, which would be Sunday following Passover. So the fact then that Jesus is actually raised according to the biblical text on the third day, and the sources are unanimous on that. All four Gospels say that. That is that seems to me the point of design, because you've got the theological or symbolic import of that. And so that again points away from the apostles being honestly mistaken and points to design, either on the part of God or on the part of human authors manipulating the story. And so again, I think that you really are left with these two options. Either you've got this conspiracy theory, or you've got the hypothesis that Jesus really did rise from the dead, right?
Yes, I would add in an option of an evolved narrative. I mean, isn't there this idea that the Gospels aren't individually written in isolation, that there's actually lots of shared content between them, and even the suggestion that there's actually an additional document that they've pulled information from. So I would probably go with it's an evolved story, and I think that's probably where I'm most comfortable on that. Yeah, because narratives and stories grow. You know, old enough to remember, but having experiences of trying to tell a story with my brothers about something that happened, and we all tell it slightly differently, and one of us has got this wild version of it, which we all raise our eyebrows at. So these kinds of things happen, and I have no idea if I mentioned, if I've discussed it with you in my own thing, but I've got this own thing in my own mother's lifetime. There was an incident in Zambia where my mother was kidnapped for a day, and I won't go into all the gory details of what happened there. It's quite dramatic, and some really terrible things happened that day. And she was eventually rescued by the police. By the time it got to her funeral 30 years later, there was somebody standing up saying that what had happened was the church had got together and they had a big prayer meeting, and there'd been a clap of thunder, and the people who were kidnapped had got scared that God was intervening and let her go. Completely and utterly false narrative. And I'd grown up on the story of this kidnapping because it's a significant event in my family's history. It's mentioned in at least 2 books as far as I can remember. And this whole miracle part of it never featured at all until the day of her funeral. And I questioned my brother about it. I said, where did this come from? And he said, actually, there's a document that we've got written that Mum wrote, which mentions it. And I said, really? Anyway, going through her stuff, I found this document, and this document was written 10 years after the event. It doesn't mention any of the moments from the miracle. It just talks about the facts about what happened, which align well with the book that the story is written in. But there's no mention of the prayer meeting or the thunder or being released. She actually talks about in detail of being taken in a truck to meet the police who took her away. So I know that this miraculous account that was described about her is utter fiction. What I don't know is how it got there. I don't know who instigated it. I don't know how many people talked about it. All I know is somebody on the day of her funeral talked about it. So these things happen within somebody's lifetime, and I assure you, it's quite distressing when it happens to somebody that you love. So I can certainly see how things like this can evolve quite extraordinarily within a relatively short period of time. I'm not going to offend anybody by trying to come up with an idea of how we got to a resurrection from a point where I don't believe it happened. I think it would be to insult people's intelligence to do that, and I think I'll probably be wrong. But I'm more convinced that there's a likelihood that it evolved from something much more mundane and got to what it is. But I won't go down the road of speculating how that might have happened.
Sure. I mean, in regards to the first point I brought up there was the literary dependence of the Gospels, and you're absolutely right that the Gospels, especially Matthew and Luke, tend to draw upon Mark quite a bit, and scholars argue that the mainstream scholarly consensus is that is what's known as a two-source hypothesis, where Matthew and Luke utilize Mark as a source, and then Matthew and Luke also have another source called Q that they're using as a source because sometimes they agree where Mark diverges. But there was also independence among the Gospels as well. Scholars debate to what extent John is independent of the Synoptics. I tend to think there's some literary dependence, but I think that John is much more independent of the Synoptics, and the Synoptics are on each other. But there's also even independence within the Synoptics. In particular, the Passion and Resurrection accounts seem to be largely independent of each other. And the resurrection accounts also seem to be very not particularly. There's no signs of legendary embellishment. So, for example, one of the key texts in Second Temple Judaism concerning resurrection is Daniel 12, where the righteous of Israel are portrayed as shining like stars at the general resurrection, mass resurrection at the end of history. But no one ever thinks to portray Jesus as shining like a star, which is a legendary embellishment that you might expect. There are also other interesting features of the resurrection accounts, which seem unlikely inventions. The fact that women are the chief witnesses of the empty tomb, for example, seems unlikely if it's a legendary embellishment, because any later account probably had male witnesses be the chief witnesses of the empty tomb. there's also the fact that they seem to be devoid of theological reflection. Matthew in particular loves to say this was done so the scripture might be fulfilled, and he quotes the scripture, but with the resurrection narrative, there's none of that at all. There's yeah, so there's in my assessment, there's the gospel accounts seem to be devoid of that sort of theological reflection, legendary embellishment, and also seem to go back very early. So 1 Corinthians 15, for example, verse 3 through 8, which is the famous oral creedal tradition, whatever seed are passed on to you is first importance. So Christ died for his sins in the course of the scriptures. He was buried, he was raised again the 13th course of the scriptures, and so forth. And then it talks about the different appearances. That seems to go back fairly early. And the resurrection belief seems to be something that was very widespread. It goes back very early. There seems to be no sect of early Christianity that denied the resurrection. It's something that seems to have been quite universal. And also the Gospels, as I've said before, seem to be grounded in substantially reliable eyewitness testimony. Just one example quickly. So in Matthew chapter 10, this is an illustrative example of a phenomenon that you see throughout the Gospels, where there's this interesting correlation between the frequencies of names and the use of a disambiguator or qualifier. So my qualifier or disambiguator is McClatchy to distinguish me from other Jonathans who shared my first name. And the ancient world also had these sorts of qualifiers or disambiguators. And you may have heard this before, but this is from Matthew 10, where it lists the 12 apostles. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon. Now, he's number one ranking in Palestine, first in terms of male Jewish names. So first Simon, high ranking, called Peter. So you've got a disambiguator or qualifier. And Andrew, his brother, is low ranking, but he's nonetheless identified in relation to his brother. And James, who's a high ranking, number 11th name, and the son of Zebedee, which is a qualifier, and John, number 5 ranking, his brother. Philip is 61st equal, so low ranking, no qualifier. And Bartholomew, 50th equal, so no ranking, no qualifier. Thomas, not even the top 100 male names, so no qualifier. Matthew, high ranking, number 9, the tax collector, qualifier. James, qualifier, the son of Alphaeus. He's got a high ranking name, number 11. Thaddeus, low ranking name, number 39th equal, no qualifier. Simon, high ranking name, the Canaanian, qualifier. And Judas, high ranking name, Iscariot, who also is a qualifier, who also betrayed him. So you see that sort of correlation where the names that have high frequencies also have a qualifier or disambiguator. And the frequencies of names differs quite starkly between Palestine and Egypt, just that even the male Jewish names differ, quite radically between Palestine and Egypt, and also they vary over time as well, just as they do today. Names like Archibald and Nancy are less popular today than they were like 50 years ago. So, and so that sort of pattern, and even if you are close up to the facts, your intuition about the relative frequencies of names is unlikely to be very reliable, and so that pattern seems to me to be something that's very difficult to fake and suggests that the authors are indeed close up to the facts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. My obvious question is, what's the data that's being compared with to get the names?
Do you mean what's the sources? So the sources would be ossuaries and documentary sources from the first century Palestine. Yeah.
Okay.
So this analysis on the names was conducted by Richard Balcom. He's a British scholar.
Yeah, it's a name I've heard before. And do we know what time period they cover either side of?
I forget exactly, but I could check that for you.
Okay. I have heard of it, but I've not analysed it in detail. But I am vaguely familiar with this. The point of the questions was, does a few decades really make any difference to these kinds of names? I would imagine that the name's popularity would possibly not move as much as they do nowadays. I mean, these days with global news, etc., name popularity can change quite quickly. It wasn't that long ago when Kylie was a really popular name. Now it's there are other pop star names which are more popular. I suspect that Donald will become a very unpopular name in the next couple of years. So I would imagine that during that period the popularity of names might change on a lower frequency. So I don't see it being an issue.
What's interesting though, is that the apocryphal sources from the second, third, fourth century, the Gnostic and apocryphal gospels, they don't have that. They don't have that correspondence, so it doesn't pan out for those because they are far removed from the facts.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, the Book of Acts gets lots of difficult things right. In the Book of Acts, in particular, there's more than 100 examples of these sorts of hard things that the Book of Acts gets right. We're not talking about easy things like who was the emperor at the time that everyone would have known, but very specific, nuanced things that is best explained by the author being a witness to that which he talks about. And if Luke, or the author of Acts, was someone who was indeed a traveling companion of Paul, and was indeed, as he claims to be, with Paul in Acts 21, when Paul visits Jerusalem, then he actually met with the Jerusalem elders, including James and the other apostles. He was imprisoned along with Paul in Caesarea Maritima for 2 years, and so that which is quite close to Jerusalem. So he would have had access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to Jesus' ministry and his resurrection, and therefore, and Luke seems to indicate that he, in his prologue to his gospel, that he got information from eyewitnesses. So that would be quite consistent with that. He would have access. He not only claims that he interviewed, or that he received information from eyewitnesses, but that he also shows evidence of actually having access to those eyewitnesses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think getting little things right for me is fair enough, and probably certainly it would probably imply that some early knowledge was used, or sorry, what am I trying to say? It would certainly imply that there was some basic documentation or basic stories that were certainly used as a foundation, and certainly stuff that was known. It's a really hard leap to get me from those more mundane things correlate to something that's the complete opposite of mundane. That's the leap for me. I'm quite happy to accept that those mundane things correlate to this kind of low-level knowledge and legacy and stories coming down, whether they were written down or transferred verbally, whether they were written by a third party or whether they're written by the original. It's very, very little consequence to me. It's getting from those things, even if they're all 100% right for the reasons I've already mentioned earlier, it doesn't get me to that really special thing. And it's for this whole thing that we disagree on about. This is something that's really extraordinary, so I need something that is a little bit more special to get me to take it more seriously.
So would you at least grant that demonstration of accuracy on difficult mundane matters, and especially when highly specific, is epistemically relevant to the less mundane matters?
Yes, I'll go in that direction without too much difficulty. Yeah.
Okay, so
it's getting me to the extraordinary. Yeah.
So it is epistemically relevant because demonstrating the correctness of the accounts on difficult and specific mundane matters shows that they are indeed individuals who are close up to the facts and well informed. And that is directly relevant to showing the resurrection because it shows that these resurrection accounts also come from those same authors.
Yes, but for the mundane things, there's no consequence to whether I believe them or not. You know, if let's just pick something mundane. A street boy stole a roll of bread from a baker and ran off, and he escaped with it. Okay, yeah, fine. Whether I believe it or not is of absolutely zero consequence to my life today. And if something else is accurate, then okay, yeah, maybe he saw that as well. But it does absolutely nothing. It's the extraordinary event, the resurrection. The consequences of accepting that, believing that, are quite literally life-changing. There's an enormous consequence to accepting that, and related to the consequences of accepting that, I need that elevated level of assuredness to be able to get there.
Sure, and so I think what you're saying is that although the prior ability is not affected by how much it's going to impact your life, nonetheless, you need a higher level of, you need to attain a higher posterior probability in order to justify embracing Christianity again. Is that fair summary?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more nuanced, but yeah, it's definitely in the right kind of ballpark.
Okay, cool. So how much certainty would you need in the resurrection in order for you to consider being a Christian?
That is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. Although it would probably need to be 100%. I mean, I was 100% sure of it when I believed. And if I believed again, I would probably need to be, because it's the linchpin of the entirety of the Christian message. So I don't know how I could be a Christian and not be anything but 100%. Or
I'm not
although the Bishop of
right?
Durham in the UK did call into question the resurrection 30 years ago, didn't he? So
yeah, that is correct. But I mean, I'm not 100%, right? So I'm a Christian. So let's suppose that. I mean, I would say that I'm not certain Christianity is true, but I'm confident that it's true.
okay.
And I would argue that one of my pet peeves actually is people atheists talking about the word faith, because faith, in my opinion, so you don't no beliefs do not require faith, right? Faith is something which is warranted in response to evidence. So I would argue that faith is directly correlative with the amount of evidence. The more evidence we have, the more faith is warranted in a particular position. So there's a direct correlation, in my view, between the amount of faith that I exercise and the amount of evidence I have for a particular proposition to which I need to commit myself. So let's suppose hypothetically that you were 95% convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. Would you lose any sleep?
Probably. Actually, let's take it in the context that without anything else, by the end of this video call, you were able to convince me that the resurrection was true to that level of confidence, and none of the other Christian beliefs were in me at that point. Yeah, I would have a terribly sleepless night over it. I absolutely would, because if it did happen, okay, I'm currently in a position where I doubt it, and I really don't know how I could believe it. But if that event did happen, regardless of whether or not I believe it did, of course I'd want to know, because the consequences are, as I've already said, enormous. So I absolutely would want to know. And yes, if you were able to get me to that point where I was doubting my doubts to that level of severity, it would be more than one night of lost sleep, I can assure you.
Okay, and what about if it was 80%?
Probably very similar. It would.
Okay, so does the evidence that we've talked about and you've studied on other occasions for the resurrection, does it make you wonder whether Christianity might actually be true after all, even if you're not fully sold on it?
Not anymore, because I did all that wondering during my deconstruction process, and all of the stress and all of the sleepless nights and all that happened during that period. And for me, the basic question was, how far is it reasonable to go wanting something to be true and not being able to get that need scratched? How far is it reasonable to go before you say, I give up? And I've gone past that point where I give up. So I don't lose any sleep over it now. I don't wonder seriously about it now, because what I haven't told you about is all those things that happen post deconstruction. You know, those moments of self-doubt, those moments of anger at your former belief, then the questioning, and then the depression about, well, how could I have been so stupid to believe it? All that stuff all came after the process. So I've gone to the point where, to use a colloquialism, the ship has sailed. I've done my wondering, I've done my questioning, I've done my begging on my knees, I've done my crying myself to sleep, begging God to do something to reveal himself to me, to something to help me to believe, because I needed to. I've been through all that, and I'm at the point where I am now because I didn't get what I'd been begging for. So for me, what was critical was, how far do I do that before that's it, before the door's shut, before I'm done? How often do you look for the keys under the cushion on the sofa before you come to the conclusion that they're not under the cushion on the sofa? And that was the point that I've got to, and I passed that a long time ago. So I don't really wonder. Nothing really causes me much concern. I would need something quite significant to happen for me to backtrack that. I don't necessarily mean a Damascus Road event, because drugs might be able to explain that. But I would need something quite significant to yank me back. But I'm comfortable in my non-belief now because I've been through the stress. I know I said the ship has sailed. That kind of implies a finality. I'm not the kind of atheist who says no, never. But I would need something quite significant for me to go, okay, now it's time to reanalyze. But because I'm genuinely quite comfortable in my non-belief now. The obvious follow-on question is what, but I don't know what the answer to that is.
Do you think that could take the form of historical evidence, or would it need to be something more immediate and experiential for you?
I don't know how I could get to historical evidence, because history by definition is really hard to examine. I've given my own examples from my own family where something from history, recent history, my own lifetime, not my own lifetime, but people who I knew history, and they turned out to be less than accurate. So to go back even further in time, it's really hard, and I don't know how we could, short of a time machine, I really don't know how I could be confident enough in those events for me to seriously reconsider. Personal experience, maybe. But again, if it can be explained by drugs or dodgy foods or something else, then God needs to do something a little bit better than that. But I'm not going to rule out experience, but I don't know how an experience could do it.
So if we were to suppose hypothetically that Christianity, instead of being based on the resurrection, was based on something like Titus's destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, or Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, would you be more inclined to be a Christian if it was based on one of those events?
Good question. Unlikely. It's funny you should mention the Rubicon, because in preparation for something completely separate, I came across this snippet about, I think it's Suetonius, who wrote something about the crossing of the Rubicon. And in his account of it, he talks about this figure, tall and full of glory, whatever, who appears before Caesar when Caesar's doing his thinking, and gives Caesar the confidence, and he steps into the water, and I can't remember what words are said about let the die be cast or whatever. I think that's the phrase. And then this figure disappears, and you read it through, and on a superficial reading, it sounds like an angel. It reads like an angel visitation. So reading through that, I have no problem whatsoever with the crossing of the Rubicon as an event. But do I believe the account from Suetonius of this figure appearing before Caesar and them having this conversation and giving him that confidence, and then this figure disappearing again? Well, I don't believe that part of the account. So it's back to this whole thing of, there are things which are mundane, which I can accept, but this is an example of an ancient historical narrative which has something in it which reads like it's a fabrication that's inserted into the story, either by Suetonius himself or somebody else. But that figure of that narrative about that particular individual reads like utter fabrication to me.
Okay, well, maybe that's a good place to stop. But we've been going for an hour and 50 minutes, I think.
What we don't,
So,
oh, golly, we have.
so that was a really great conversation, though, Matthew. Thanks for coming on, and we'll need to do this again sometime on another topic.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. We did hint about some things. It will be great. This really was great. I listened to your conversation with Jake earlier, and I appreciated that. And I was confident that we could have a similar amicable conversation. So thank you for that. I really do enjoy this. Sometimes on social media, I can be a little bit spiky. I accept that. I'm glad that this wasn't. So good. Thank you. I enjoyed it, and thank you to people who are listening, and I'm quite happy to answer any follow-on questions. I've not seen what comments are down there. Please be nice to me. Yeah, I'll answer questions that can be answered if people have anything.
Right. Well, thank you, and we will sign off here, and I'll sign off the live stream, but Matthew, stay on Zoom. Okay. And folks, also remember to subscribe and click the notification bell, and also go over to the Still Unbelievable podcast and check out Matthew's material there as well. In particular, the conversations I've done on Matthew's own podcast, I think are quite instructive also in talking about probability, miracles, the resurrection, and that kind of thing. So go check those out as well. Right, signing off here, and I'll see you guys in a future live stream.